Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Global Dashboard. We keep you up to date and hopefully helping you climb the learning curve out there on all things global. I'm Ellis Cannon, your host, and as always, joined by our global expert, Dan Joseph, more than 20 years of business in China and business all over the world. As always, we'll start with our news roundup. Obviously, more on Afghanistan. COVID isn't done yet. We'll take another dive into Afghanistan, still the biggest foreign policy story, the last 40, 50 or so years. We could talk about that in our quest to understand it, what to learn from it, and how we could do better down the line. And then, of course, surely to my chagrin and detriment, we'll have another episode of the Global Dashboard Quiz, which, if you haven't seen, is a funny show on television. And we're not on television. Hello, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing great, Ellis. Great to be back. Back in the saddle. Much to talk about, as always.
Yes, indeed. Dan, let's start with the roundup, starting with COVID in particular. Here in the United States, of course, the quibbling goes on all the way from vaccination down to masking at school district levels. It's driving a lot of people crazy, as we've seen the dips and the turns all the way along the way here. We're trying to get back to normal, but Delta's changed all of that. What's it look like around the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's around the world is similar, kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You know, it seems like many of the hotspots that we were talking about 6 to 8 weeks ago, India, Indonesia, Brazil, have actually peaked, and they're doing better than there are other countries. Vietnam and Malaysia, for example, the trend isn't so positive, which is shutting down factories, affecting supply chains. You know, there's still economic impact on top of the health impact. Europe, like us, is trying to get back normal at different speeds. The UK has removed about all restrictions. Other countries are taking, varied responses relative to masks, opening schools, restaurants. It'll be interesting to see in a few months what works and what doesn't. A little bit of an experiment comparison, if you will. And even low incidence countries like, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, those countries that shut down, island type of countries, they haven't necessarily peaked on Delta yet. And they're trying to figure out how to go from zero tolerance policies to living with it, trying to ramp up vaccinations. So it's mixed all around the world. It's still uncertainty what's going to happen with this Delta. Mostly good news, but still we're not past the risk of Delta. On the economic front, unfortunately, some gray clouds ahead. Australia, because they've locked down again so much, they're expected to go back into a recession. Japan's in a similar position. China's overall numbers have been good, but a lot of it's because first people were catching up on imports from out of China, and now they think they're importing early for Christmas, because when you look at other indicators in China, like the services index, things look a little less rosy. So China, because of additional lockdown measures, may be slowing down. The United States has had some weak numbers after 2 good quarters in a row. So we're not out of the woods. Hopefully we don't go back into negative growth, but the rebound may be at risk. Too early for anyone to know for sure, but we'll be keeping our eye on that. And then politically, as we've talked about, the prime minister of Japan's losing his job basically because they don't like how he handled COVID, and their numbers are so much lower than us. It's interesting. At the same time, it will no doubt will play a role in other elections. And then we have the instability in places like Haiti, Cuba, Colombia, Nigeria, Tunisia, South Africa. So I think that will continue to play out over the next 6 to 12 months as low income countries, kind of tend towards instability anyway. And then you throw something like this at them and it brings all the worst things to the fore. So still long tail left for the COVID crisis, and we'll see where it shakes out globally.
Interesting. So in other words, things are settled and instability's gone. It's good to know that we're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Dan, you mentioned China. Honestly, I mean, every time you turn around, periodicals, articles, internet, there's always a ton out there about China. And I know with your background, it's a gift to be able to go through those issues with you, particularly when we take deeper dives. But as an overview, you had mentioned them in COVID. What's going on with China generally, particularly on an economic or domestic front?
Well, I mean, this last week, China suspended approvals of online games, which sent their gaming companies around the world, their stocks down 10+%. This comes on the heels of a regulation that's basically limits children under the age of 18 from playing more than, I think it's 3 or 5 hours a week, which comes on the heels of all kinds of other regulatory announcements. It's been 2 months of announcement after announcement, all of them shaking up. You remember they outlawed basically private tutoring, which cratered some of the best companies in China. So China is making a regulatory point right now, which is that it's trying to shake things up, crack down on practices it doesn't like. That's not so much the problem as it comes on the heels of really a stall in their overall economic reform program. So this is an ongoing story, but where China's going right now is from growth to stagnation because it was economic reform that got them to this point, and they're turning their back on it. One more thing we can cover at some point down the road. There was a new story that came out this week. It appears that China has engaged in a little bit of that kind of fake account social media propaganda that we got the Russians on during the last election, trying to spread theories about COVID starting in the US, drumming up interest in protests against racism in the United States, protests that weren't actually occurring, Google, YouTube, others shutting down accounts. The impact of, they tried to, they do this stuff and hoping that they'll drum up interest in a protest. No protest occurs. So they show videos of other protests and try to claim they were happening. So there's no impact, but the fact that they're kind of mucking around in this type of activity says a little bit about where our relationship is with China. And we'll be keeping our eye on that moving forward. Needless to say, Americans aren't going to be thrilled about that.
Yeah. Two things, Dan. One, and of course, those are serious matters, but is it okay if I'm okay with limiting kids playing video games? I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. I know the government intruding is an issue, but my point.
No. Here's the thing. Some of these things that China does aren't necessarily bad ideas. But the fact, but that doesn't mean the way they handle it is the right way either, right? It doesn't mean slamming down, changing, forcing people to make certain decisions, changing the rules, midstream overnight. Doesn't mean any of that's the right way to go about it. But not everything China does is, contrary to common sense. There's some good ideas, but overall, the direction they're heading in is a problem. Yeah, as a parent of a 13 and 14-year-old, limiting online time is not exactly a radical idea to me.
No.
A lot of time thinking about how to do that.
Experience. Anyways, let's talk about Afghanistan. Speaking of not great experiences, of course, there's so much going on around the world, but Afghanistan, once again, the biggest story for a lot of people, and understandably so. We know the numbers. We've talked about this before. 20 years, $1 trillion, thousands of lives lost, thousands of injuries, tens of thousands in that department. Whether we're talking about Afghans, United States. Americans or what have you. Yet apparently, we're right back where we started. So let's do a little bit more in this unfolding drama and start with this past week. Tell us a little bit about this past week and what we saw from the Taliban.
Well, so a quick wrap up. So, the United States completed the pullout. The Taliban seems to have cleared the last area of organized resistance, at least for now. It doesn't mean they're secure in the seat of power, but sometimes I think these tribes, they fade into the background while they gather their strength. So maybe there's going to be a push from some opposition, but not right now. The Taliban announced a formal government. They made some appointments, which, surprise, surprise, include a few folks who were actually on, the terrorist list for the United States and our allies. So protests in Afghanistan have been pretty much outlawed. So from that point of view, the whole idea of kind of a kinder, gentler Taliban doesn't seem to be borne out by what they've done so far. We'll keep our eye on that, but it looks like the same old Taliban. On the good news front, flights out of Kabul have resumed, and it appears there's an agreement for a flight to leave today on Qatar Airlines with 200 Americans and some others on it. So, ongoing evacuation is a good sign, but there's no other reason to be particularly jubilant that the Taliban is now consolidated its authority. The proof is in the pudding. We'll have to wait and see. We got a long way to go on this, but it looks like the same old Taliban so far.
Well, that's a great point. And with respect to the flight you just mentioned, I mean, that's been a big issue in the United States. Of course, there was a holdup. Why was there a holdup? How do you get the green light? What was behind the green light? Were there conversations, discussions? We could unpack that as well, and certainly will. And we've talked previously about multiple implications, short-term, long-term, from the developments in Afghanistan. Where does that flight fit into those implications, just off the top of your head?
Yeah, well, we're going to have a lot of developments over the next 12 months, but most immediately, if we get into a situation where we've got a lot of foreigners, it's not just Americans stuck over there who can't get out, and the Taliban is preventing that, we're going to see a lot of pushback, and it's going to really reflect negatively on the whole way the withdrawal was executed in general. So if we have these private flights, apparently Qatar Airlines is stepping into the gap here and is going to be running flights every day, and we see the rest of our allies and others getting their people out, that will probably get us over the most immediate and dangerous hurdle. And then we'll have to turn our attention to all of the Afghans who were assisting the United States and its allies, and there's thousands of those. I have a feeling that's going to get much more difficult than original passport holders for these countries. But those are the biggest hurdles right now. And then we move into, how Taliban's going to rule, what they're going to do about Al-Qaeda and ISIS within the country, how they treat their past enemies, women, others. That's all coming down the road. But these are the more immediate issues.
Yeah, and Dan, I have to say they are, and yet, to use a phrase you did earlier, when we talk about longer tail, like you did with COVID, I think that that's an appropriate thing with respect to those sectors of people you just described. We know that there's different categories for many of them, and you make an excellent point about it. The blowback's not done yet, that at least domestically, as it relates to the evacuation, and that story is yet to be written.
And just to add to that, just the long, we relevant and less relevant. There's been fighting in Syria over the last weeks. The Syrian government is still trying to take control of the rest of the remaining pockets of resistance. That war seems to be winding down, but nothing's changed. So who knows what's going to happen there? The Iranians are saying they're refusing to respond to nuclear inspector requests while saying the deal's going nowhere. Now, some people don't like that deal, but the point is the nuclear threat of Iran's gone nowhere. I mean, North Korea is worse. They're making their own same old basket of threats. We've got ISIS all over North Africa. We're right back where we were. I don't know what trajectory some of us might have thought we are, but I mean, it's like Groundhog Day. Everything's new, and it's going to be interesting. This whole shakeout it's probably not a coincidence that right after, while all of this stuff is happening in Afghanistan, China has done a number of flyovers towards Taiwan, taking their military planes into Taiwanese airspace, reminding everybody that that's still an issue. So it should be, we speak about the long tail, it should be an interesting year ahead for foreign policy issues.
By the way, speaking of North Korea, did you see the leader's new look?
No, did I miss a photo?
Oh, yeah. He's a different person. It's a different person.
He's his own guy. So
yeah, well, no, it's not just that. I think it's a different person. You see what I'm saying? When you see visual images, you'll get a very good idea what I'm talking about. Dan, you talked a lot the last couple of weeks about the SIGAR report. I know that you consider it a treasure trove. Talk a little bit about it as you continue to review it.
So what we want to do with our kind of our deep dive segment is just keep building on what we started. If you happen to listen to last week's podcast, we focused on a lot of the big implications of Afghanistan, how it's going to impact foreign policy, our relations with our allies, our adversaries, and on down the line. And we referenced this SIGAR report, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. It's a group that was authorized, I think, within the Defense Department, authorized by Congress, actually, to do investigations going back more than a decade on how things are going in Afghanistan. They've written a whole bunch of really interesting reports, the kind of things that probably get filed away on a shelf somewhere, but now seem terribly relevant. So we're going to be using that part as our playbook because, Ellis, from our point of view, as we discussed last time, it's not enough to simply say, well, let's not do that again, because we're going to have to deal with countries like this. This threat isn't over, whether it be from Islamic related countries and potential terrorist threats, or just instability in other low income countries, less developed countries. This problem isn't going away. And it's more important. It's critical that we not just say, well, we'll never do that again. We got to know why we made these mistakes and come up with some ideas to deal with these issues in a more effective way. And that's the conversation we want to have. And we're going to use the SIGAR reports as kind of our bouncing off points and guiding, because they got great information in there. I thought I would start this one. Last time we talked in general, I want to talk about something that the SIGAR report talks a lot about, which is how we fail to understand the context, which I would describe as the cultural and societal context in Afghanistan. And when you have the wrong strategic understanding, it almost doesn't matter what tactics you take. Those tactics are going to fail if your strategic understanding is wrong. So let me just real quick draw on my own experience. And I'm not going to go into my own personal stories too much, but just to alert the audience, I lived for China in 10 years. I've been doing business over there for more than 20 years. Most of my time in China in kind of off the beaten path places you've never heard of. I like to describe it as, I'm the only one who speaks English in the room. Okay. And I spent 3 or 4 years managing some manufacturing facilities in places that you would call the Appalachia of China, coal mining country. Anyway, and when you listen to this podcast, I hope you'll find that perspective insightful, refreshing, and a lot of interesting stories, by the way, but I'm not going to dive into all that right now. What I will tell you is the cultural differences are crazy. It's overwhelming. It just smacks you in the head. I mean, leadership, they're much more authoritarian, not just in the government, but in the family, at work. The boss has all the prerogative. People aren't empowered. The rule of law issues. I mean, take your pick. I mean, corruption, coercion, fraud. I've personally had, plenty of experience with all of that in a place like China. So these kind of issues, they force you to adapt to how you manage and how you do business. You can't just ignore them. I would say that as a business person, it is more incumbent upon me to react to that than it is someone working for a government agency where the money just keeps coming. Anyway, I became so interested in kind of this topic, right? That you start, and I'm kind of a nerd, so I do a lot of reading. It turns out there's a lot of scholarship, books, research from places like Harvard and Stanford and Michigan and good organizations that delve into this, the difference between advanced and less developed countries, the cultural differences, and other sorts of things. There's a great book out of Harvard, which is a collection of essays by 20 different researchers called Cultural Matters: How Values Shape Human Progress. Basically, you read that. When I read that, you've got guys from Latin America, Africa, Asia, all describing the same set of cultural challenges. There's a really good book by an organization called the Cultural Values Survey. These guys have been, the World Values Survey, I'm sorry. They've been taking surveys of countries around the world for 40 years, 100 countries. And let me tell you what their conclusion is. One, the cultural divide between less developed countries and developed countries is huge. Secondly, in order for any less developed country to democratize, they have to change the culture, including the rule of law. And thirdly, elections don't do that. Okay, economic growth does. So what's interesting about this, if you don't mind me saying, is there's actually theory out there and examples out there of how we need to view these countries, what the challenges are. The problem is we just haven't absorbed all that. We haven't taken it all in yet. So we go into a place like Afghanistan, we don't understand the challenges. Let me just give you one example from the SIGAR report really quickly. The one SIGAR report mentions that corruption is a big problem in Afghanistan. And it mentions that Afghanistan is ranked very low. There's an NGO called the Transparency Index, which measures, prepares something called the Transparency Organization rather, and they measure, they use surveys to try to measure corruption around the world. It's called the Corruption Perception Index. 0 is totally corrupt. 100 is no corruption whatsoever. And they mention that Afghanistan doesn't score very high. What they don't mention in the SIGAR report is no less developed low-income country scores well on corruption. They're all bad. In fact, if you look at the numbers, there's no low-income country that scores above 40. And there's no high-income country that scores below 70. So the point is, the rule of law is very highly correlated with the level of development of your economy. They don't mention that in the SIGAR report. We need to know that going into every country like this. So I'm going to give an example. Let me stop there, Ellis. Is any of this, I mean, I always like to say, as I said before, you like to use the phrase, you can't export democracy like bananas. Right? And you're absolutely right. And what I'm trying to do, and what I think we need to do with this Afghanistan thing, is unpack it to understand why. So I hope I'm not saying stuff that's too nerdy or theoretical or conceptual, but I'm trying to put it all together. Am I making sense so far?
Yeah, no, you are. Let me say this, Dan. Two things. We're the United States. We have the State Department, and we have just about any other resource at our disposal to know the cultural differences in every community of every country in the world. Yeah, it's a bit of an overstatement, but you get my point. I mean, why should we be lacking in understanding cultural differences in any of these places?
But we just don't understand it. Look, and I'll tell you why. For 200 years, we basically held this point of view. Countries that are not democratic should become democratic as quickly as possible. The way they do that is have elections as quickly as possible. Hold your elections now. China has performed brilliantly economically. Does anybody point at that? No, they don't have elections. They're not democratic. It's terrible. Okay, that's just the way we've been doing that for 200 years. We've been wrong for 200 years. It is time to understand why. Now, let me give you a great example of what I'm talking about, of how we need to adjust our approach to countries like this. Okay, let's talk for a second about the Soviet Union, Russia, and China. Both of them in the 80s and 90s, coming off the communist experiment. Communism has completely and utterly failed. They've melted down every doorknob they can. There's nowhere else to turn. They're going to move away from communism. Of course, the United States has closer relations with Russia at that time, more interaction. Our standard point of view, you got to have elections. Let's have some elections. What do you think about elections, guys? So before you know it, Gorbachev is gone. Yeltsin is voted in. And then Yeltsin decides he's going to lean on a bunch of American advisors, some very prominent economists from Harvard, a guy by the name of Jeffrey Sachs. How am I going to turn myself into a free market economy? Well, I'll tell you what, they came up with this idea for a rapid transition to market economics, free market economics. And it was actually given the nickname shock therapy, which was not what the designers of the theory intended it to be. But the idea was, in a very quick amount of time, we're going to come. So what they did is they had an auction for all the big state-owned companies overnight. Okay, this turns out to be a terrible idea. This is how we come up with the concept of Russian oligarchs, these guys who somehow, using corruption and coercion and whatever criminal means necessary, come to control the largest, best companies in Russia, which, by the way, since Russia has so much in terms of natural resources, are almost all natural resource companies, plus the airlines, the automobile companies, all of a sudden in the hands of these private citizens who are shady. And in fact, we've had the best, there's rule of law so weak in Russia, there's no paper trail for any of this, but we have testimony. One oligarch has sued other oligarchs in places like London, and we see this testimony. It's all shady. Okay. And since then, Russia has averaged less than 1.5% GDP growth. If you take the oil and natural resources out of Russia, there's nothing there. There's no economic story. And obviously the democracy is totally fake and phony. Right. So what did Russia get out of that? By following we're all ready. Everybody is ready right now for democracy, and we're all ready for capitalism. Let's do it all today. And they fell on its face. Now let's think about China. Here's what China did. Coming out of the 70s, China's at the lowest point you could possibly be, called, the famine of the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. Millions are dead, total poverty, society's devastated. Deng Xiaoping, 4'11" chain-smoking, card-playing leader of the Communist Party at that time. He'd been kicked out of the Communist Party 3 times. He spent a couple years in France, but otherwise had no connection with the world outside of China and knows nothing about capitalism. Here's a couple of things he does know. 1, communism isn't working. 2, the capitalism idea seems pretty good. But here's the important thing. Here's what they don't teach you at Harvard. Here's what Jeffrey Sachs didn't know. Deng Xiaoping knew he could not trust other government leaders in China. There's no way. He can't watch them close enough to rein them in. He knows he can't stop them from doing whatever they want to do, taking what they want to take. So he doesn't say, listen, we're going to move to the free market tomorrow. He said, no. I'm not even going to take a whole city. He went to a place called Shenzhen, a city in southern China. And he starts, not even the whole city, but he takes a geographic part of it. He says, this is going to be my special economic zone. I can't stop you outside here, but in here, no, I own this. You'll do what I want in here. You'll follow my rules or you'll pay the price and you'll deal with me. And I can watch 25 square miles. I'm not, it's not that hard. And guess what? They start, they allow private enterprises, they encourage foreign investment, and the Shenzhen free market zone, special economic zone, takes off. It booms. So they do another one and another one and another one. And pretty soon they've got 20 of them. And then they went from there to spreading that throughout the country. Gradual. So here's what Deng Xiaoping does different from the Russians. First of all, I'm not starting with politics. I'm starting with economics. Secondly, I can't control corruption, so I've got to work around it. Okay. I'm going to create incentives. So my government officials, I know they're not going to become uncorrupt overnight, but I'm going to teach them that it's better to be a little less corrupt when the goose is laying golden eggs to be totally corrupt and kill the goose. So I hold this out as an example of no American leader would have ever said to any country, here's what you need to do. You don't need elections tomorrow. In fact, don't focus on the political side. You ought to start on the economic side and you got to go gradually. Nobody would say that, but that approach worked. And I want to point out one more thing and I'm going to turn it over to you. One, some of you might be saying, but China is terrible right now. No, it isn't. Yes, they've backtracked. I get it. But if you think China was going to be democratic anyway after 40 years, that's the same rose-colored glasses that led us astray in Afghanistan. How? It took the United States of America 100 years to go from the end of slavery to the end of segregation. How in the world is any country going to go from total communism to democracy in 40 years? The progress China made economically is not just economic. It drives the cultural change that forms the foundation for democracy. Now, China's backsliding, but some backsliding is going to occur. And yes, we have to push back. I'm not saying we tell China everything they're doing is great. What I'm saying is, how did China outperform Russia? By taking a different approach. And that different approach is how we have to think about handling countries like this, because what Russia did, the same assumptions that led Russia down the trail of the massive failure, those same assumptions went into what we did in Afghanistan, which is why we failed there. Does any of that make sense?
You gave me a lot. You gave the audience a lot. It's a great, it's a very interesting comparison. And now I have a bunch of questions.
Okay, go.
So when it comes to the economics, and I'm going to go in no particular order, although when you did mention shock therapy as being the way to go in Russia, let me just say that my experience with shock therapy has nothing to do with Russia, nor about economics. That's just me. Second of all, you talk about doing the economics as opposed to the political, but there's a fine line between working with countries in economic terms and policy, particularly when it's not inherently theirs, and throwing money at something like we did in Afghanistan, yes, which only made it 100% worse.
Yes, that's a great point. It's not money, it's how the money's coming in, right? I mean, so here, just as an alternative theory, maybe what we should have done in Afghanistan is found a couple of the tribal areas in the north where we had some good relations. Maybe we should say, listen, we're going to form a special economic zone with you right here. We can't change the whole country, but we can help you. Okay. So we can help your agriculture. We can help maybe set up some factories, maybe do some mining in a small area, gradually with real market-based investment, do some exports. Meanwhile, provide the security you need. We can't shut down all of the security issues in the country, but maybe if we align ourselves with the right group, we could have done it in a small part of the country. And then they start to pull ahead of everybody, right? And then other regions, other tribes say, we'd like some of that. Now, I'm not saying that recipe is exact, but something like that is what we need to consider, not democracy now and hundreds of billions into infrastructure projects, which does nothing to change the culture, doesn't ignite economic growth. It's all superficial. And clearly, as we just demonstrated, it crumbles as soon as you walk away.
So, okay, I get the economic zone development, and I won't call it hopeful, because I think that anything relative to Afghanistan, if we're going to have an honest conversation intellectually about what can we learn and how to go forward with those lessons, so to speak, needs to be outside the box. So you present something outside the box. Now, if there is one, and I'll say tribe, if there is one tribe or one region that gets what you just said and said, we're going to employ the Dan Joseph economic zone, and this is it, there'll be, and I'm only using numbers, there will be multiple numbers, 10, 50, 100 times that might look at that, or very likely will look at that as a westernization, as something completely different than their culture, that is the antithesis of what they believe in religiously. So again, I get that, and we should look at every option and turn every rock. But those forces are not insignificant, even if that one economic zone looks like it's doing something, quote unquote, better.
So I'm just throwing that out there as an idea.
I know.
The key point I'm making is this. We need to understand the conditions, as Deng Xiaoping did when the other Americans and Jeffrey Sachs did not, relative to Russia and China. Once you understand that the rule of law is weak, they're not culturally ready for democracy. Once you get that, you change your approach. Once you realize it's going to take them 50 years anyway to make serious progress, you change your approach. You think smaller and you think more gradual. By the way, if I gave you that idea in 2004, you would have said, you're nuts. But if I give you that idea after we've been there for 20 years and spent $1 trillion, I mean, if we're going to be there for 20 years anyway, maybe we should take a more incremental approach so we can get something out of it. But I'm not saying that's the answer. What I'm saying is, I consider the Russia-China comparison to be a great example of thinking outside the box and how America has to understand what Deng Xiaoping did, because his strategy was way better than Russia's, because he understood the local conditions. We need to do that.
Okay.
And by the way,
let me just say this about Deng Xiaoping. It's amazing what he got done between card games and cigs.
Yeah, right. He was changed. Yeah, he's what. Look, nobody's perfect. We have to judge people within the cultural context of which they live in. We don't do that anymore in this country. But Deng is basically China's Lincoln, the UK's Churchill. That's who he is. I mean, Lincoln or Washington for us. He's huge, terribly successful, and really great ideas, and an interesting character too.
The cultural differences, though, that you're talking about are part of this, and they specifically are relevant to this entire tactic versus strategic dichotomy or space, if you will, that SIGAR report discusses. Because, as you say, if you don't have the right strategy, you could use the best tactics and it's going to fail.
Exactly.
You raised a couple of other interesting points, though. When we start talking about those cultural differences, and this is more of an aside, this is more like if I was going to interrupt you, which I really don't want to do, but the truth of the matter is that, I had a friend fly once to South Korea, several times to South Korea. And once he survived like the 38-hour flight nonstop, he got there. And one of the things he said when he got back is, you understand from an interpersonal perspective, it's different. The space is
yes.
So see, I think if you think of it, when we start talking about culture, again, that's a loaded word.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and depending on the context you use it can mean so much.
Yes.
And the idea of just being able to tweak it and change it and all of that in our own country is extremely difficult, as we're finding out again. But to put it into more personal space, I think people get a better handle of how complex and difficult it is to do on a governmental or larger scale, when some cultures don't want you within 5 feet with or without COVID.
Yeah, look, this is a long conversation and we're going to be having it. But to summarize it here, we just have a lot of misconceptions on culture. And when we talk about culture, a lot of times we're talking about little things like what color is lucky, what color is unlucky, and little things like that, like you said, personal space. The first thing we need to understand is no. That's culture too, but there's also cultural values that relate to critical issues, like how creative and innovative. That's culture, okay? And how productive, how well people work together. Leadership, whether it's authoritarian, don't ever question me, or egalitarian, more teamwork oriented. All of this stuff is actually critically important. And the number one thing is the rule of law, which is a whole subject into itself. So you got to get rid of all the things that are kind of a sideshow and focus on what really counts. And it's not taught because it's not perceived to be critically important. I believe its importance. I mean, most companies send their people to manage operations and do business in India and Mexico and China, and they give them no preparation whatsoever. Believe me, I know this, and it's foolish, I think. I think you're going to see, if I have anything to say about it, more attention being.
But here's the irony. The United States consistently has held to the belief that it has been conceived almost, if you will, out of a form of exceptionalism. If something is exceptional, if something is based on exceptionalism, do you know what that means, Dan? It not only means it's special, it means that it's unique. And if it's unique in its exceptionalism, the consideration that we can just take something that is exceptional, that is only to us, and make it portable. And that's a fundamental irony at the very least, and a major flaw at its worst.
But you're absolutely right. On the one hand, America, I believe, became the foremost, most successful democracy and advocate of freedom because of exceptional characteristics. I think that's true. You could point to unique aspects of our past that other countries don't have. However, in my opinion, clearly the way we're behaving now, that doesn't give us, carte blanche to do whatever we want. We can turn away from those principles. Plus, look around the world. Look at where the Europeans are now. Look at the Australians, the New Zealanders, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan. Fortunately, the values that brought us here and the practices, they can be picked up all around the world. We had, and again, we're going to have this conversation. We're just not going to do it now. There were a particular set of factors that allowed us to climb that curve, if you will, earlier than everybody else. But that doesn't mean others can. It's amazing what the other China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, it's amazing what these people have come from totally different historical and cultural perspectives, and yet are so much like us now. So I think it is there. These are universal principles. There were exceptional circumstances which allowed us to grab them first, but that doesn't mean we own them. And I do think they're more universal than that, but we have to understand how they're spread. And I don't think we do that very well. And because we think, and again, we can unpack this for hours, we think that what made us special was we had elections early on. Here's what I like to say. Two countries became independent from the UK and immediately implemented the institutions of democracy. Okay. One of them was the United States. The other was India. I mean, do we have anything in common with India? No. They've had 70 years of this. They're not anything close to on the path that we were on. So clearly there's more here than elections and independence. And those are the lessons.
Well, just forgive me. It just, when you got into that riff, I was making notes and I thought, and I do think that there's value in at least raising them. Hey, Dan, I want to pick up where we were just a little bit ago with respect to the cultural and societal differences that we've elaborated on. The SIGAR report understands that in the sense that it approached it and analyzed it. What were some of your takeaways?
Yeah, it's the section of their main report that's called the context, understanding the Afghan context, which, as I said, really refers to, I think, cultural and societal issues. So let me just read a few of the quotes from that section, which I actually absolutely love. As practitioners, this is a quote from the SIGAR report, as practitioners followed the counterinsurgency script with insufficient attention to local context, they implemented projects that sometimes unwittingly supported one power broker or interest group at the expense of another, thereby stoking local conflicts and creating an opportunity for insurgents to form an alliance with a disaffected party. What does that mean? Hey, we thought everybody would get along great. We threw money at it. It turns out the tribal affiliations were never broken, and people would use the money they got against their enemies. Surprise, surprise. Here's another quote. By legitimizing warlords with political and financial support, the United States helped empower a class of strongmen at the local and national levels who had conflicted allegiances between their own power networks and the Afghan state. Indirectly, the United States helped to lay a foundation for continued impunity of malign actors, weak rule of law, and the growth of corruption. Although, okay, so I'll just stop that one there. But I mean, again, it's the same type of point. Here, let me, Afghanistan, here's a great one. Afghanistan did not simply revert to its pre-surge state. Donor aid had reworked its power structures. Elite capture had created new grievances and exacerbated old ones, as some groups benefited from the war and others were alienated and driven toward the insurgencies. The winners often ran the government for personal gain, and many committed major crimes with impunity, creating a kind of mafia rule. Some became wealthy off U.S. contracts and used their money to buy immunity from prosecution by paying for seats in parliament. So again, we're throwing money, we create this democratic structure. We throw money at different projects, but underneath it all, Afghanistan is still a tribal country. The warlords, the tribal leaders put themselves in position to collect the money, and then they use that money for the benefit of themselves and their tribe, and to heck with the Afghan government. And again, no wonder it crumbles so quickly.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And, you know, I got exercised last week with the concept of a warlord. Again, we start talking about customs and cultures. You know, I think if you ask most Americans, a guy may say, hey, I know some warlocks, but I don't know anything about warlords. Okay.
Let me I want to get into a couple more that are just specific to the military, a little more specific, because I want to make a point on them. So let me get to this one. In Afghanistan, retention was a major challenge for the Afghan forces, with one estimate suggesting that Afghan National Army attrition stood at 2% per month, or roughly 24% per year in the mid to late 2000s. By 2020, Afghan security forces were still replacing a quarter of the force annually, which the U.S. military had come to view as normal. Okay. Secondly, in Afghanistan, the United States seems to have labored to develop an Afghanistan army that could not be derived from the Afghan population without significant cultural shifts, including the erosion of factionalism, the development of a stronger educational system. Okay, so let me unpack that for you. So the reason I wanted to read these is, even right to the end, right, when we have to figure out how to withdraw successfully, and we have to figure out, is the Afghan army going to stand or not stand? Well, for 20 years, we've had tribalism dominating the government. We've had 1/4 of the army turning over. We have no reason, if we understand the local context, we have no reason to think this is a real army. It's an army we patch together, and as soon as we leave, it breaks apart, because we haven't really changed the society. From the government through to the military, 20 years, they just go back to the original tribal identities. This is the major strategic mistake that we made that has caused so much of what we thought were gains to absolutely evaporate. And this, if we don't fix that part of it, as I said before, the tactics don't matter if the strategy's wrong.
Dan, I like that phrase. And I think it's more than a phrase. I think it's true. That doesn't mean that there aren't elements that can't be applied in terms of what we've learned, the do's and don'ts, and applied to other cultures. Afghanistan's a lost cause.
No, but and you're making the point. Exactly. My point is, we still have to learn to be more effective with low income, less developed countries. Now, there's a lot, most low income, less developed countries like a China or a Russia, believe it or not, those countries are actually a generation ahead of, or 2 generations ahead of Afghanistan. I mean, tribal, when you're talking about tribal, that's the bottom of the basement. We have a hard enough time with these other countries. But when you look at much of Africa and how that place is being torn apart, the wave of kidnappings in Nigeria, which at one point we're going to cover, that's just nuts. But there's still a lot of this bad behavior. And my only point is, fine, maybe we've learned the lesson. We can't sit anywhere and put $1 trillion into some country for 20 years. That's a great lesson. But we are going to be confronted with challenges. We need to learn to manage 85% of the world's population lives in countries that have a per capita GDP that is 25% or less of ours. 40% of people in the world, 3 billion people, live in a country with 5% or less than what we have. These problems aren't going away. We need to be more effective in these countries. And to do that, we need to learn the lessons from the biggest mistake we've ever made in an emerging market in a less developed country, Afghanistan, $1 trillion, 20 years, so many dead, accomplished nothing, unless you want to say maybe we prevented some terrorism along the way, but all of that could be reborn again. So that's what we're going to keep looking into. And the point we have made here today is we need to have a better strategic sense of the challenges on the ground. That's the point, which I think you agree with.
That's big. That's a huge takeaway, and the cultural differences are those challenges. And I think, Dan, one other takeaway, just based on the last 30 seconds of your comments, would be a simple question. Not asking it, but I will ask it. Okay. How?
Oh, right.
Because that's the essence of it.
My China example, I give you to say that is an example of how out of the box thinking that isn't traditionally American thinking can have much better results. I don't say that's a blueprint for what we must do. I'm not saying we copy that, but how about starting to think outside the box? How about not democracy now? How about a longer term perspective? Let's start smaller, think gradually. How do we emphasize the economic side, since that's more important? These are the things we need to start talking about. What I want to do on this show is bring some, we're going to have guests in here, bring in some outside experts and dig even deeper into like that tribal culture in Afghanistan. How should we have handled that? So I think there's a lot more to learn about this. Right now, we're just hitting on the major points.
I mentioned at the very beginning something about a quiz.
Oh yeah, we're going back.
Something you want to?
We're going in again because I have too much fun with this.
No.
I keep telling you that it's not always going to be you answering the questions, but then again, I'm the one that's always. But I'm always putting you on the hot spot anyway. All right, I'm not sure these are fair either, but let's stay in the region. Number one, Afghanistan is a stan country, a cluster of countries with a stan at the end. How many stan countries are there, and how many can you name?
7.
Oh my gosh, right out of the bat, you're on. And I didn't even tip you off. Are you reading this is incredible. Can you name them?
Hell no. No. I don't know why 7 stuck in my head. Kazakhstan, obviously. I mean, right. My son studying graduate school international affairs. He mentioned a couple the other day. They run together, but I some reason 7 popped in.
Oh, that's off. And I thought I had you. Boy, I tell you, you're good. You're really good. Well, anyway, for the sake of our listeners, it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Now, if you would have asked me, I would have known off the top of my head 5 of them: Afghanistan and Pakistan, obviously, and then Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. I would have known there are more, but I couldn't list them. So I don't know if I'd have guessed 6 or 7. Anyway,
that would have been a win by me.
You hit it right on the head. So I thought I had you. Anyway, number 2, I don't know, a little bit more subtle. Pakistan has a population of 216 million. For the remaining stans, we're going to put the over under for the total population at 100 million. Are you taking the over or the under?
Under. Wrong.
It's over. Just barely. It's about 110 million. Again, I'm kind of cheating you on this one, simply because
come on.
It's right at the. In fact, I've got different. It depends on whether the population of Afghanistan is 33 million, which I read in one place, or 40 million, which I read in another. But basically, it's between 100 to 110. The rest of them are in the 60s.
Hey, okay, Dan, I got to be honest with you. I was going to do this for a joke. When you started to ask the question, I was honestly going to answer under before you even got the question out. So I thought, so I didn't. That would have made it funnier, but nonetheless, I was going to go with it.
Well, knowing your background,
my winning streak is over.
Knowing your background in sports media and sports broadcasting, I thought using the over/under terminology would be familiar.
I love it.
Anyway, I think that was cheating because it's barely over 100 million. So I'm taking advantage of you on that one. But let's go to our final one. Which of the following is not an Afghan proverb or saying? Not. There's going to be 3 of them. Number 1, one studies and becomes a teacher another studies and becomes a nuisance. Number 2, community is not created by force. Number 3, like dew rolling off a leaf. Again, which of these is not actually an Afghan proverb or saying? Number 1, one studies and becomes a teacher while another studies and becomes a nuisance. Community is not created by force, or like a dew rolling off a leaf.
Hey, Dan, let me ask, seriously, I mean, do I got only one answer here? I mean, I can only pick one?
One of them is not. The other 2 are, in fact, Afghanistan.
Well, there's at least 2 that aren't, but
by the way, I admit this is not fair at all. I don't know why you would.
No, I'm not so sure they've had dew in Afghanistan for.
Hey, it's a very
dinosaur age, for God.
See, I like the way you think. You're smart. That's very good. But it is a very diverse climate. They have dew in parts of the country.
Okay, so I'm going to go with nuisance, the first one.
Actually, it was dew. I led you off track. It was dew. So
no,
not only I'm also deceptive. There's nothing fair about this whatsoever. I love the fact that community is not created by force, is actually, I mean, now that after these 20 years in Afghanistan, we can think of a whole bunch of things that do not create community, like infrastructure spending and elections and a whole bunch of things. But apparently the Afghans are already well versed in the fact that force does not create community. And I also love that one studies, I don't know, a lot of times idioms are similar from culture to culture, but I've never seen one that said, if you get too smart, you're going to be a nuisance. I'm not sure that's a real.
Yeah. I mean, you would think that getting smart is good, but then again, well, in retrospect, in retrospect, I think I got a little confused with what is not.
Yes.
That negative thing there. I should have stuck with my original thought about dew. Oh, well, you only get so many bats in this league, Dan.
Live and learn. Look at that. We're just trying to educate the audience. No,
I think it's actually very
globally savvy.
Right. We're like a national. We're like a vocal and audio version of an updated National Geographic.
Exactly. That's what we're doing.
It's a public service.
I'm glad you see it that way. Patting ourselves on the back as we should.
Sure. I'm done, Danny.
That's all I have.
You have a good week. I will do it again.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. All right.
Bye-bye.